Diseño para la innovación social es generar proyectos que realmente tienen un resultado y un impacto en el largo plazo y que son soluciones de base, remitiéndonos mucho a ese usuario o a esa usuaria justamente para solucionar una problemática de personas, desde personas. En mi caso, por ejemplo, están relacionadas con temas de seguridad alimentaria, con temas de aprovechamiento sostenible de recursos naturales, también contar con la participación de las personas para todo el proceso de diseño. Soy mamá de un peque de 5 años, estoy justamente como directora general en una organización, entonces el reto de estudiar una especialidad como centro es un reto muy fuerte, pero que ha valido totalmente la pena.
Ya no voy a dar marcha atrás ya nunca, porque es una mentalidad y una manera de trabajar que no tenía antes, llevar el diseño estratégico y el diseño de experiencias a otro nivel, analizando y cuestionando constantemente cómo el cambio va a afectar el futuro de nuestras profesiones. Los futuros te permiten estar como un paso más adelante y poder conectar entre el pasado, interpretarlo en cómo lo vivimos ahora, pero también cómo queremos ser y hacia dónde queremos que nuestras industrias vayan. Mi nombre es Mayra Álvarez, soy egresada de la especialidad del diseño del mañana, 7ª generación en Centro.
En definitiva, hay un Carlos antes y un Carlos después de la maestría. Los estudios del diseño es una manera literal de atacar problemáticas a partir del research. Cualquier proyecto visto a través de los estudios del diseño nos lleva a escenarios que posiblemente no nos imagináramos. Proyectos de escuela fueron los que me abrieron la puerta a un trabajo nuevo. Soy Carlos Moreno, estudié la maestría en estudios de diseño en Centro.
Bueno. Ustedes me dicen, ¿eh? ¿Ya empezamos? ¿Ya empezó la transmisión? Buenísimo. Bueno, pues buenas tardes. Pasen a sus asientos. Pues antes que nada, muchas gracias por asistir, tanto a quienes están aquí en persona en Centro como a quienes se han conectado a la transmisión en vivo por YouTube. Yo soy Jorge Camacho, soy el director de la maestría en estudios de diseño aquí en Centro, y junto con mis colegas Paulina Cornejo y Carla Paniagua, que son también respectivamente las directoras de la especialidad en diseño para la innovación social y diseño del mañana, pues hemos actuado como anfitriones de Ilana Lipsett esta tarde, Nos interesaba muchísimo tener su participación, su visita, su charla, porque como van a poder ver y ya pueden ver incluso desde el título de la ponencia, que es Diseño comunitario y futuros participativos, pues desde luego conecta claramente con estos 3 programas que mencioné: la maestría en estudios de diseño, la especialidad en diseño para la innovación social y la especialidad en diseño del mañana, y desde luego en general con los temas que nos interesa abordar, explorar en centro, en posgrados y en centro en general. Antes de presentar a Ilana, nada más les cuento un poco. Pues va a hacer Ilana una actividad breve, su ponencia, y después vamos a tener también algunos minutos para preguntas y respuestas, tanto aquí para quienes están aquí presentes como para quienes se conectan por YouTube. Entonces estaremos pendientes del chat en YouTube también por si quieren enviar sus preguntas. Y justo la charla también va a ser en inglés, pero esas preguntas y respuestas las pueden plantear en español. Ilana entiende perfecto y habla también muy bien español. Entonces hago también el cambio yo a inglés para presentarla. Ilana, thank you so much for being here. So Ilana is a community design strategist and participatory futurist. Her work has been at the cutting edge of where policy, community engagement, and development intersect. She was recognized by the Obama White House as a champion of change in civic innovation for her work co-founding Free Space, an initiative to temporarily transform vacant spaces into community, cultural, and arts hubs. She's a trained futurist, having worked at the Institute for the Future, where she co-created a course on design futures, and she holds an MBA in sustainable management from the Presidio Graduate School. Ilana is also a commissioner for the City of Oakland's Cultural Affairs Commission, a board member of the San Francisco-based nonprofit Farming Hope, a garden-to-table job training program that works with people with the highest barriers to employment. And also, she sits on the board of Reallocate, a nonprofit that connects talent and resources with challenges around the globe. So, Ilana, thank you so much for being here. Let's welcome her.
Muchas gracias a Jorge y a Centro y a ustedes para venir y para venir aún si es en inglés. Entonces voy a cambiar en inglés ahora. Before I started, I wanted to see if somebody in the audience here could share with me what is the future vision of the Centro community. No one? Okay, that's actually the correct answer, because no one person can share the future vision of a community, right? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before I start, I wanted to ask you all to partner with who you're sitting next to, and just share a couple minutes about what is your role here at Centro in the community, and what is your vision for the future of the community of Centro. And second part, if you have something in common with the person you're talking to, if you have the same vision, just go ahead and raise your hand so we can see how much there is in common and how much there is different. So we'll take just a couple minutes now. Again, share with 1 or 2 people in your row, what is your role here and what is your vision for the future of Centro? One more minute, un minuto más. Okay, I hear a lot of ideas. So if you could wrap your conversation and raise your hand, lava la mano y si tienes la misma idea que tu compañero del futuro del centro. ¿Alguien tiene la misma idea? Nadie tiene. ¿Sí? ¿Ustedes? Do you want to share what you guys talked about?
Platicamos un poco acerca a pesar de que yo obviamente tengo un rol internamente y pero Arturo no, platicamos acerca de la importancia de que Centro sea una plataforma para que el diseño y la creatividad participen positivamente como hacia el futuro, y Arturo hizo un apunte importante, que es la necesidad de que esa labor sea de adentro hacia afuera de Centro, ¿no? Que no se quede aquí internamente, ¿no?
Gracias. And how many people agree with that or also have that as part of their future vision? There's no right or wrong answer. So yes or no is fine. Great. Anyone else want to share? What did you talk about for your future vision for Centro? Yeah.
Bueno, no fue tanto como de la comunidad de Centro, sino somos egresados de la especialidad de Diseño del Mañana. Y decíamos que teníamos como esta parte que sí integra a la comunidad, que es sensibilizar a las personas sobre el cambio, ¿no? Que sí existe esta parte de fomentar el pensamiento colectivo, ¿no? Y facilitar la toma de decisiones hacia futuro, ¿no? Entonces es esta parte que siempre hablábamos nosotros en el curso de democratizar la parte de los estudios, pero precisamente es para sensibilizar a la gente que sí puede generar un cambio, ¿no? Es que sean un poquito más optimistas sobre ese tema.
Es un tema que vamos a revisar. And how many people agree with this? This is also part of your vision for the future of this community. Some? Okay. Maybe one more person who wants to share what you talked about? No? Okay. Well, thank you for participating in that little activity. The point is that, as you could see from the beginning, there's no one person who can have an answer for what the future of a community is, right? And that's why we need to be including as many people as possible, allow them to define their own roles in the community, and then give their ideas. And so that's a bit what we're going to talk about today. So thank you again for having me. Thank you, Jorge, for organizing. And I think I wanted to start with this as if anyone has been reading the news recently, you know that the future needs all of us, right? It's kind of all hands on deck for creating a future that we want that's more equitable, that's more inclusive, that's more sustainable. And my belief is that we can't do that unless we're using participatory design and participatory futures. So I first wanted to define that, and then I'll get into some stories and examples of projects that I've worked on or projects that I'm familiar with, and talk a little bit about some of the philosophy and ideas behind participatory futures. So first, two quick definitions of how I'm going to be using this terminology today. So participatory design. How many of you have heard of participatory design? Diseño comunitario? Okay, a few. So the way I'm using this today is that participatory design is creating with and not for end users, where the process is just as important as the outcome. So the process that is transformational, that's inclusive, that is engaging, has just as much an impact on the people who are participating and on building community and building relationships as the outcome, if it's a product or a service or a policy. So the process is just as important. And participatory futures, I think, takes this one step further. And this is a definition adapted from Esta, but as a range of techniques that engages and involves people in shaping potential futures together. So we're doing it together. And in doing that, it democratizes and makes accessible long-term thinking. It teaches people how to think more like futurists to allow everyone to participate in creating a more sustainable and inclusive future. So change is coming, whether you like it or not, and whether you're prepared for it or not, which is why I think most of you are probably here studying social design or studying futures to be able to be more prepared for the change that's coming. And I want to talk a little bit today about why participatory design and participatory futures will help us prepare for that change that's coming, for a better tomorrow and for a better today. So there's three, I think, main goals and kind of and results from using participatory design and participatory futures. One is that it helps people align around a common purpose. It helps increase our capacity for more vitality. And it builds skills and creates more long-term thinkers. And all of this, I think, helps us build community and build connections with the people that we are actively creating futures with, that we are involving in moving towards better futures. And the reason that I think this is so crucially important is that community is literally the difference between life and death. There are so many studies that have come out over the last 20 years that in times of crisis, in times of social crisis, in times of climate crisis, a strong community makes the difference between life or death. And outcomes in communities that have strong ties are so much better than communities that don't. And so for me, all of this is moving towards building community around creating the futures that we want. Has anybody seen this before? Oh, great. One person. Okay, cool. I love that. So this was an experiment, or an art project, actually, done by an artist named Candy Chang in 2010 in New Orleans. So that was 5 years after a massive destructive hurricane that hit New Orleans in the United States. And much of the city was still destroyed. The buildings were still empty. The city had not rebuilt yet. And this artist, Candy Chang, put boxes of these stickers all over the city next to abandoned buildings, inviting people to write what they wanted that building to be. And so she was inviting, as part of an art project and part of an experiment, but inviting people to contribute their ideas towards a future of their city. And she got, I don't know how many of you can see this, the ideas were all over the place, from a place to sit and talk, a community garden, maybe, you know, some of the things you might expect, to an official haunted house, or Brad Pitt's house. I don't know how successful they were in getting that to become Brad Pitt's house, but it was a creative way of engaging people in aligning around a common purpose, which was, we want our city to be better. We want our city to be different. And a lot of developers and community builders around the country and around the world have adopted this now and have used this technique to invite people to contribute their ideas. And I think that's great, but it's not enough, because it doesn't help people think differently about the future. As I think those of you who are in the Futures program know, it's really hard for us to think about the future. And so these open-ended questions are a good step towards inviting people in to participate in design and futures, but they need to go further. So I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about some projects that I think do push people further and get us towards these goals. So the first one, aligning around a common purpose. For me, this is about moving from problems to potential. And for moving from kind of the lowest common denominator, what's the smallest thing that brings us together, to what's the biggest thing that we can become, or that this community can become. So in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, there was a neighborhood called Columbusplein that had a lot of social problems. There was poverty, there was crime, a lot of what you might expect in a big city. And an artist, a Spanish artist, but who was living there, Jorge Mañez Rubio, was brought in to work on some of these social problems. And he spent a lot of time walking around the playground and walking around this particular playground. And he started to think, you know what, this looks like it could be a flag. Why don't we try an experiment where we, for a temporary period of time, create our own nation? We are going to become the Republic of Columbusplein. And in this independent nation, we're going to think about the things that we want, not the things that are driving us apart right now. And so he initiated this idea and invited people in to do collective world building, to do speculative futuring in real time with each other in this community about what this neighborhood could become. And so they created a sense of identity with a passport, and asked a lot of the residents what they wanted to have in this neighborhood. And they created their own space program. I think that was a kid's idea, but they decided to create it. And then they created Olympics games, and they had kids and adults, including police officers, participate in these Olympic games and have a great time doing it, and used the power of play as a method for doing futuring and for doing world building and for kind of building trust in a neighborhood where there wasn't a lot of trust, and in building community. And this experiment of the Republic of Columbus-Spline was actually so successful in addressing a lot of these social challenges that the City Council of West Amsterdam officially recognized Columbus-Spline as a micronation. So it still exists within the country, it still has to follow the rules, but they acknowledged it as its own entity. And they created a stamp and have all these other projects going. So it was really a way of inviting people, again, to think not about their problems, but what is their potential, and to play and to have fun and to build trust and to build community with these long-lasting impacts. So halfway around the world, I'm going to take you to San Francisco on a project that Jorge mentioned in my introduction that I worked on about 10 years ago called Free Space. And similar to Columbus-Spline, Free Space, which happened in a building but took place in a neighborhood that had a lot of social challenges. There was gentrification, there was a lot of drug dealing, open air drug dealing, there was a lot of crime. And a group of us got this building, and we got it for free somehow. It was on the market for $25,000 a month, but we convinced the owners that we would do something cool with it, and they said yes. And so we immediately opened the doors to the community and said, what do you want to see here? What do you think, what are you dreaming of as a possible future for you, for this building, for this neighborhood, for this city, for this community? And the creatives came first and painted murals all over the building, which was this immediate kind of signifier to the rest of the community that something was happening. And so then people started showing up at this very curious place and coming inside and asking, what is this? What's happening here? And we always turn the question back to them. Well, what do you want it to be? What do you want to do here? And so it became this center for complete participatory design and futures, where in the first month alone, we had, I think, 120 events, all created by these people who showed up and said, what is this? And so we had a number of principles, not rules, but the number 2 especially, that free space is a participatory space, no spectators. So if you come, you're expected to do something. And just that invitation sparked people's imagination, and people started saying, oh, I want to launch this new project, or I want to host a paella making workshop, or I want to do a coloring club for adults. And people kept coming with these ideas, with gardens, school field trips. This was one of my favorite, actually. There was a designers who brought a youth group and had the youth draw their vision of their superheroes. Who would they be if they were a superhero? And then came back with a costume designer and helped them actually become their own superheroes and help them step into this future that otherwise they would not have been able to, and let them open their imagination. And for me, the best part about Free Space is that it actually had a lasting impact on the community. This is a kind of before, during, and after image, before where we got the building. The middle was with all the activity and the aliveness and the art. And the bottom is the opening of an arts nonprofit who ended up taking over the building. And so this arts group that couldn't find an affordable building for them to rent, to have studios for their artists and whatnot, came and saw Free Space in action and said, this is where we want to be. And so they were able to sign a lease and have a home. And so it has become this ongoing hub of art and community, and has been able to stay in lasting hands. So those 2 examples for me, stand out as ones that help a community align around a common purpose, both in these communities with a lot of problems and challenge, but both projects help people step out of the how are we solving this one problem into what is the highest potential that we can see for ourselves and for this community. It also, as I mentioned, helped foster community building, whether that was through play or whether that was through art or whether that was through kind of curiosity, but allowed people to build community and build relationships that then continued on. As with the first example we saw, it became its own micronation, and with the second example that it became a community art space. So it had these long-lasting implications. The other thing that these two show for me is, so whenever I'm challenged by a social problem, I always look to nature for answers. And one of my favorite natural phenomenons that I'm kind of obsessed with is called the edge effect. And it's this idea that where two distinct ecosystems overlap, so the river and the forest, there's the most amount of new life and diversity of life and potential for new life, because you have ecosystem A, you have ecosystem B, and then you have the creatures and life that's adapted to the overlap of those two. And so I think both of these examples, Columbus Blind and Free Space, show how the edge effect can happen in social ecosystems, where we have people from all different backgrounds with different perspectives, with different priorities, overlapping in a particular space and creating more life. And so that is actually the next point that I wanted to make about what participatory design and futures can bring, which is to increase our capacity for more vitality or for more life or for more capacity in a space. And I think this comes, again, from more inputs, which equal better outputs. We'll get to in a second. Thinking about it this way helps us see social systems and neighborhoods and societies and communities as living systems. And so we're solving for more life. We're not solving for problems. We're solving for more life. And it helps us build resilience. So I'm going to show a couple examples. But before, I just want to kind of zoom in on one of the points that I said, that more inputs equals better outputs. Or if you think about it the other way, fewer inputs equals worse outcomes. And the way that I want to describe this is with the idea of default design. How many, especially those in the design program, how many are familiar with default design? Okay, great. That's totally fine. So default design is kind of the idea that everything in our world has been designed around kind of one singular persona, and it doesn't fit our very diverse world. Right? So an example of that is that when NASA was planning the first all-female spacewalk, they actually had to delay their plans because they realized at the last minute that they didn't have spacesuits designed for women's bodies. And so I don't know why it took them till the last minute to realize that, but they had to delay so they could create more spacesuits. I don't think actual spacesuits in space, they were wearing high heels, but that's what Stable Diffusion, generative AI, said a female spacesuit would look like. So that's also what happens when you have default design as your programmers of generative AI, but that's for another talk. Another example of this is crash test dummies, the dolls that they use to test the safety of cars. All of these crash test dummies are based on the size and weight and height of the average American male. And so this is not just an annoyance that you have to delay a spacewalk. This actually has fatal consequences, because car crashes which are deemed safe for the crash test dummies are actually not as safe for women and for children. And last, another example of how dangerous default design can be when it's not inclusive, when we're not looking as broadly as we can and taking as much input as we can. Until very recently, medical textbooks only talked about how diseases presented on white skin. And so that led to a lot of misdiagnoses on skin that is not white. So a medical student in the UK took it upon himself to create an atlas of what diseases look like on brown and black skin. So again, just a little detour into default design, but I'm going to bring it back to participatory design and participatory futures as an answer to that and as a response to why default design needs to change and needs to broaden. So the first example the first story I want to talk about is the Hall, which again is in San Francisco. This actually was just a few blocks away from Free Space, and my work at Free Space led to the Hall. And this was an abandoned building in about 2014 that some developers bought the building, and they had plans to turn it into this apartment building with ground floor retail, but also knew this was a challenging neighborhood. They wanted to help build community. They wanted to do something good for the community. And they also wanted people's input into the actual design of the building and into the activities of the building and into kind of the future of this neighborhood. And so we opened this temporary restaurant called The Hall that had a number of different food stalls. It had a band, it had a bar, it had space for a band, it had tables, so people could come and gather and have this as a gathering place. But we went above and beyond that, and we hosted community meetings there. So people could come and talk about what their vision for the future of the neighborhood was. We had people give us input as to the future of the building itself, specifically giving us ideas for what did they want in the ground floor, how did they want the design to be, and had a number of community workshops where people were able to, again, give their input into the future of the building, of the neighborhood, of the community. And one thing that this helped us realize, actually, by collecting all these inputs that we thought were specifically for the future of the building, we realized that there was actually a much greater need around the neighborhood in that moment, which was there was a really high unemployment and a lot of people in the neighborhood who had really high barriers to employment, either because they were unhoused or they were in jail or they had a history of drug abuse. And so there was a real need to create some sort of pipeline to employment. And so we partnered with the police department and with a number of different jobs providers to host a series of jobs fairs where people could walk off the street into the building and find out about job opportunities, they could apply for jobs, they could apply for job training programs, they could get help with a lot of different things to help them realize this need of getting more jobs. And in doing so, it also helped build community between the police and the group of the local community, the local residents who historically had a really bad relationship with the police. So again, it was this idea of listening to what was there, listening to as many inputs as possible as to what the neighborhood wanted to become, what people needed, and finding that there were all these different challenges that existed that we actually had the potential and the ability to help address. Okay, so now we're gonna go back all the way around the world to Uganda, where I had the opportunity to work in Nakivale Refugee Settlement, which is one of the oldest refugee settlements in the world. There's about 110,000 people who live there permanently from 12 different countries. And when I was there, we had the opportunity to meet a man named Patrick, who's a Congolese refugee, and had created this small community center for a number of folks within his community. And they had, this is actually, I don't know if you can see it all the way in the back, a really amazing photo of the building he built with recycled bottle bricks, plastic bottles filled with plastic bags, and turned it into this building, which became a community center. And in working with this community and hearing what they wanted and what they needed, there were a lot of things that surfaced, including the people wanted a bigger central gathering place for the entire refugee camp. Because while it had been built a long time ago, it hadn't been built with the vision of it being a more permanent city, even though that's what it had become. And so there was no central planning, there was no central gathering place. And so they wanted to have this place where people could gather, where they could kind of celebrate the different cultures that were there, and had this vision to create an amphitheater. And so we worked with the community there to help raise money and to help them build this amphitheater, which has since become a central hub of culture and of community and of building relationships and allowing them to talk about their future and their future within this camp. They host activities, I think, almost every day now. And see if this video works. Yeah, and it also has become a magnet for attracting public art in this refugee camp and a social enterprise center in this camp, composting toilets, a permaculture garden. And so again, this idea of inviting as much input as possible and giving people permission and space to kind of build out their visions has allowed this to become a place where people can call home, where previously it didn't feel that way for them. The other thing, and this was to the point about building resilience, the other thing I wanted to mention is that during COVID, a number of international humanitarian aid agencies were not allowed to go into the camps for whether that was for a number of reasons, for quarantining, for distance, etc. And so a lot of these social service programs that international organizations typically provide, the groups within the refugee camps came up with responses on their own. And they showed, A, that they could do it better than the international aid agencies, but B, that they had the capacity to be resilient and to build resilience. And a lot of the community building that they had done allowed them to address the really urgent challenges that COVID provided. And there was, I didn't include it here, but there was a study that I read about international organizations now rethinking their priorities and how they work with refugee populations in order to give more kind of power and agency in the hands of the people who are most affected. So again, more inputs for better outputs. When we're looking at communities as living systems as a whole, we are solving for more life and solving for more life and more capacity for vitality than we could have imagined before, and building resilience. As I mentioned a couple of times, a lot of these projects started with culture, and they started with culture, not conflict, in places where there is already a lot of conflict. And so I think using that as a starting point, again, helps us create more capacity for life and living and building community together. And helps us find solutions in unexpected places, that people closest to a problem often have the best solutions. All right, so the last point or last benefit, I think, of participatory futures and design is that the process of doing it can be transformative and help people build skills so they also can do futuring and have it be more inclusive, gives people individual and collective agency, and if done right, is an equitable and inclusive design. So from a study from the European Journal of Futures Research, addressing citizens as contributing foresight actors provides a largely untapped resource for foresight studies. And this one I think is particularly important in the context of policy development and in government organizations where around the world we're seeing a declining trust in institutions, is when governments open themselves up to participation and to input from citizens, they again have this untapped resource, but also can work towards building trust. So in Japan, there is an initiative called the Future Design Council, where Japanese citizens, everyday citizens, go to planning departments and planning meetings to talk about the future of their cities and the country and talk about challenges that they're facing. And they do 2 rounds of this. One round is as citizens of today, of 2023, or whenever they're doing this, and talk about how they would address certain challenges. They then put on these yellow robes and they step into the role of a citizen in Japan in the year 2060. And talk about the same problems and the same challenges, but from the perspective of somebody in 2060. And what studies have shown for people who've participated in this is that those who are wearing the 2060 robes come up with policy ideas and plans that are way more transformative than the people of today. So just that very act of stepping into the 2060 and putting on this yellow robe gives people the mental space to think about more transformative plans and more transformative ways of addressing challenges. And this study also said that they also paired the groups together, the 2023 citizens and the 2060 citizens, and said that when the consensus building processes in these paired groups led to decision-making processes that, again, included the preferences of future generations. And so, again, when we're talking about wanting a more equitable, sustainable, inclusive world, we need to be thinking about the future generations. And I think the Japan Future Design Council is an amazing example of how they're inviting everyday people into futures thinking and into futuring in a way that allows them to make better policy decisions today that will impact their lives for the next generations. So this is the last example I'm going to give. This is a project that the European Union did a couple years ago called FutureGov 2030, where they wanted to invite citizens into answering the question about what is the future of government in the EU, a rather big question that they decided to open up to a very large public. So the Future of Government 2030 brings citizens to the center of the scene. And the objective is to explore emerging social challenges, analyze trends in a rapidly changing digital world, and launch an EU-wide debate on the possible future governance models. So not a small task. And what they did was, over the course of 6 months, held a series of workshops in 6 countries in the EU, where they invited people in to think about themselves in the future, but also their fellow citizens and fellow residents in the future, and how would those future EU residents interact with government? How would they interact with public services? How would they interact with social services? How would they interact with the environment? And collectively, entirely through citizen input, they created 4 future scenarios that they also combined with a very broad-based game that invited people to participate at a much more widespread level of how to engage with this question of what's the future of government in the EU. And then they took these future scenarios and they took people's responses from these games, and then they brought in the policymakers, and then they brought in the analysts, and then they brought in the designers, and with that started to come up with recommendations for the future of government in the EU. So kind of turned the planning process completely on its head, using participatory design and futures, and in the process teaching spreading anticipation principles to a larger public and empowering them on the topic of future government and governance. So again, just to recap that, the transformative process to build skills that I think a lot of this, that these 2 examples shows, teaches people how to future, gives people individual and collective agency, can be equitable and inclusive by design. That's an important point, is that it's not inherently, so you have to plan for that. It can influence policy decisions and help build trust in institutions. So I think I'm excited to hear kind of what you all are thinking about, or what this is raising for you, given the fields that you're in here at Centro. So just a quick recap, I hope that what these examples have shown is how participatory futures and design can help us align around a common purpose, increase capacity for more vitality, build skills, and create more long-term thinkers. And then just some final thoughts, helped again by my stable diffusion vision of an equitable, fun future, is, again, I think people closest to a problem often have the best solutions, but we don't always ask them for their ideas. And so we need to make sure we're figuring out a way to reach them and to ask them what their ideas for the future are. Because you can see different futures better when you look through other people's eyes. One important piece that I hope came through in some of these stories is that people also need the space to think about the future. They need space, they need permission, and they need an invitation, because so often the voices that have been left out intentionally need to be brought to the table and need to be given additional permission and invitation to contribute their ideas. And especially for those of you who are in the Futures program know, it's really hard to imagine what you can't yet see. And so that's your role, that's your job as social designers, as futurists, is to help people see things that don't exist yet, and to help draw out their own imagination to see things that don't exist yet so that we can move towards a better world. So I'll just close with a quote from Pupil Bicht, who's an amazing futurist, started the Decolonizing Futures Initiative. People don't have to be passive spectators of their future. They can be proactive shapers of their individual futures, futures of the community, and also the future of the world. Thank you very much again for having me. Thank you so much. I think we have time for, how much time do we have for questions?
10 minutes. Yeah, great. We have around 10, 15 minutes for questions. Thank you so much, Ilana. Really, really interesting and inspiring. So, any questions here from the audience? I think back there.
Thank you. Do you have any advice on working on participatory design with children? Both Marimer and I are already involved in something, and we're entering a phase in which we have to come together with them and actually create some activities so that we can get some inputs on what they want their city to be like.
I love this question. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I think I'll first start by saying I think that children are some of the best people to work with on this because they still have their imaginations, right? The world hasn't told them yet that they're not allowed to imagine and dream. And so you can, that said, you can get some ideas that are all over the place and maybe aren't as focused as you would like them to be. So I think giving people, having children give input to you of kind of what are their ideas or what are their visions for what a future might look like. And then you can work to synthesize that into, let's say, 4 worlds. And then invite them into those worlds, whether that's a story or it's an actual physical world that they can walk into and touch things and move things around. I think can be a really good way to engage. Something else I actually just recently learned about from a practitioner, I believe in Finland, is instead of asking for written input, because that can be a lot more difficult for children, they have a series of emojis that represent different emotions or feelings or things and let the kids move around and choose the emojis. Because they have this, they can relate to that, they know what it means, and it's easier for them to use that to communicate if something is working, if it's not working. But yeah, I think that building towards something with children is an amazing place to start to give them the creative agency, and then again synthesize their responses into something that they can respond to or play in. They're really good at playing, way better than we are at playing, and so that can be something that can be helpful too.
Hi, talking about creating trust in institutions, it may be a little bit pessimistic, but what happens when you invite people over and the community and have all these workshops and ideas, and it just doesn't work out and it's not like a tangible project? What do you do to get back that trust?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Also, I'll start with an example. When I'm not here, I live in Oakland, in California. Oakland is a very diverse city, and it has a very deep history of racial justice and activism, and also art and culture. About 6 years ago, the city wanted to redo the downtown and had a whole downtown plan. They brought in consultants from the other side of the country and had these input meetings where they invited community participation. And a lot of people came to these community meetings for participation, but even more people protested outside and like literally shut down the meetings. And the city of Oakland, and there were a lot of tensions, and people were saying like, how could you do this? How could you go to an outside consultant? Why are you not including, these voices? And so to the city's credit, they stopped the process and they said, okay, we're not going to work with this consultant anymore. We're going to restart the process and we want to include you. But the trust had already been broken. And so it wasn't as easy as just saying, come back, now we're going to include you. There had to be a lot of not just workshops, but community building that happens out in the community. I think that's maybe a part of it too, is that oftentimes when an institution invites people in to a workshop or a meeting, you're on the territory of the institution, right? And so sometimes you need to change where that's happening and take the meeting to a playground, take the meeting to a church, take the meeting to tianguis, take the meeting to wherever it happens to be where people are, and listen. And I think that was one of the mistakes that the institution of the city had made, was that they weren't listening to voices. And so starting from a place of curiosity and inquiry, and really spending time building trust. And it's not guaranteed that it'll work, right? I think we all know that tensions are really high when social challenges and trust in institutions is really low, and it can be really hard to repair. But I think the listening, going to where community is instead of inviting them to where you are, and making sure that it's accessible. So often, I don't know if there's an expression in Spanish, but oftentimes in English we'll say, you know, make sure there's a seat at the table for everyone. First of all, maybe the seat doesn't work for somebody. Maybe it's not accessible. Maybe they don't know how to get there. Maybe so making sure that you're taking all these steps to make the process as accessible as possible, I think goes a really long way in building trust.
Hi, Elena. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how, or give us best practices on how to translate the outputs of this community work into policy recommendations, or to communicate better these recommendations for stakeholders inside of some organizations that could maybe not understand this type of work as good?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say is invite the stakeholders into the process so they can observe. Maybe not participate if they're not the appropriate people to be participating, but invite them into the process so that they can observe. And then I think the next step would be asking them, what are their reactions? How do they observe it? How do they interpret it? Because then you start to hear their language, right? And you start to hear, and I don't mean English or Portuguese or Spanish or French, like you start to hear how they're talking about something, and how you can start to then translate the community voice and the community expression and the community language essentially into a language that they can understand. Because I think what you bring up is a good point, that kind of the translation of being accessible and being open and being participatory needs to go in many different directions. And so if stakeholders or decision makers are being completely left out, like that's also not going to work, right? And so they need to be part of the process as well. So I think having them observe, listening to their reactions, and then putting the words into and understanding their priorities too, right? It's and so doing a little bit of a balance of what's their priorities, how do the community priorities feed in and support their priorities, I think can go a long way with that.
Yeah. Can I ask one from the audience? Sergio Garcia asks, how and what are your preferred methods for gathering info or data inputs, digital versus physical, for example, polls? What do you do to gather data from the community?
My preferred method is still in person, but I also know that doesn't scale, and that doesn't that can't necessarily reach as many people as possible. And I think COVID actually showed us that there are a lot of effective ways to do data gathering and input through online methodologies. And I think one thing that I'll say to this is, which I kind of alluded to towards the end, is it's really hard for people to imagine what they have never seen or what doesn't exist yet. And so I think really open-ended questions to try to gather data can actually be really unhelpful, because a lot of times when you ask people what they would like or what they want to see in a neighborhood or a community or a policy or product, a lot of the time they'll say something that they can already see or that they already know. And so it doesn't actually get at the underlying need or desire that they have. I had a professor in grad school who would say, people don't need electricity. What they want is cold beer and hot showers. So if you can find a more sustainable way of getting them that's what they want. But they'll tell you electricity because they don't have another sense. They don't have a sense of something else. So where I'm going with this is, I think in the data gathering, I think it's important to give a sense of open-endedness, but then also have more pointed questions around the data that you're trying to collect, whether it's around a specific vision or policy idea or city or product, which I think, as I would imagine those of you, especially in the design school, have methodologies for that. But yeah, I think there's something about in-person data gathering that for me is still number one, but I think I'm pretty old school in that way. And I think there are a lot of ways to and a lot of civic tech that has come out in the last 5-10 years that's really effective at not only gathering people's direct input and data, but also allowing other people to add on and respond to and kind of give their own opinion, so you can build kind of collective responses to things as well.
Hi, I wanted to ask, what are like the challenges to keep and sustain the community's engagement over time? Because I think that's like one of the problems that no one thinks at first. And the second is, what are some of the strategies or tactics that we can think of to sustain this engagement and this sense of belonging in the community?
Yeah, great question. I will, to the first question, I will admit that sometimes I feel like I have a crisis of faith in this arena, because there gets to a point where it starts to feel extractive. If let's say you're working on a city plan and it takes 10 years and you're trying to sustain community engagement over 10 years, people are busy. People are worn out. People have jobs and kids and friends and things to do, and it starts to feel extractive to start to keep asking people to contribute. And so I think there's a couple things. One, of course, is recognizing that and acknowledging and not faulting anyone for, for kind of dropping out of participation and coming back when they need to. Compensating people for their time, I think, is huge. That only recently has been recognized as something that we need to do, is pay people for their time. It's not just about giving them food when they show up, like pay them for their time. Make it as easy as possible to participate. So digital and physical ways for participating. And make it fun in a way that actually feels like people want to be there. And it's not, the same old meeting with a lot of Post-it notes. No offense to city planners and the way they've done things for a long time. And there's something I learned in community organizing many years ago called a stop sign victory, which is that, let's say you're working on improving a neighborhood, and it's going to take 15 years, and there's this one intersection where people keep getting hit by cars. The easiest thing that you can do in improving the whole neighborhood, like the first thing you're going to do, the first thing is not change the entire road structure and do a transportation, rewrite. But you can put one stop sign at that intersection to slow cars down and to stop people from getting hit. And so these small stop sign victories along the way let people know that they actually do have agency and power to make change, and keeps them engaged along the way, having these small victories. Sorry, can you repeat your second question? I forgot what it was.
It was about the different strategies to sustain that sense of belonging within the community, and to have this hope that the projects in the future are working.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you for that reminder. For me, one of the most important things is having community members themselves create the activities and participate, because then they want to be there. They invite their friends. They invite their their community or family, and it creates for them a sense of ownership and agency over the process, and as well creates a sense of belonging, because they are part of creating. And so one thing that we did at the hall is that we were in this kind of much longer, but in this period of time, it was a 3-year-long planning process. And every month we did a community breakfast where we had people come in. One of those pictures was from that, where people could write their ideas for the building. But what we also did was we said, okay, half of the time we're going to talk about this building and our process, and the other half the time we want you, community leaders or members or artists, to come tell us about what you're doing and what you're working on. And we have this built-in audience of 60 people or so who show up, and tell them about your projects, tell them about your theater, tell them about the safety meeting you're having, whatever it was. And so people really felt like they were genuinely part of the process of working on not just this one building, but this kind of the larger surroundings of what's happening in the neighborhood. And they were being recognized for it, and they were getting, they were being recognized as leaders. So I think opening up the engagement activities and ideas and asking people themselves, like, what would be fun for you? Do you want to have a street party? Let's do it. You want to have like a cat adoption day? Let's do it. You want to have a library? However crazy and wacky it is, you know, as long as you have the resources to do it, I think can go a really long way to maintaining that engagement, to your first point, and sense of belonging to the second.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, if there are no more, those. Okay. We have 5 minutes. Okay.
So I'm going to ask like from the other side, because most of these projects require a long time. What happens when there's like governmentships, or when the organization that started this process changes and probably has a different direction, but you already had like a community build that's committed and that feels a distrust? Have you ever faced that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. One of the best answers I heard to this question, because it's super valid and it happens all the time, is make something that people love so much that they'll get angry if the government takes it away. And so, you know, much easier said than done, of course. But I think when you find the right thing, people are going to want to come regardless of, you know, what's happening in the government. And yes, I have seen, I was working on a project in Texas that was, it had to do with activating streets. And the community was really excited about, you know, putting in some more parks and putting in more land and being able to activate the streets. And the government, which is very conservative in Texas, basically came in and said, well, all this money that you initially thought you were going to have to do this, we're actually just going to make more freeways. And completely killed the project. And unfortunately, sometimes there's not anything you can do about it in the immediate, but you can also harness that anger that the community has towards, okay, well, what can we do? And how can we maybe pivot or refocus or work on something else? What is within our control? And then how can we use that to continue to maintain community energy and to build community support around doing something that they can affect. So I know it's not a perfect answer, but I think your question is right on point, that a lot of times the situation and the circumstances are not perfect for it either. So do what you can.
Hi. I'm curious, a lot of these things they need money to make the world go round. And where have been some ways that you've found getting money for these kinds of projects very successful? And where have you had more challenges? Like those might be dead ends if someone's trying to create a community participatory project.
Great question. I would say the two of the more successful ones, the funding came from a private family foundation, which is definitely not easy to access and definitely not super widespread. But if you have access to a private family foundation, no, I do think though, to that point, a lot of foundations, at least in the US, I don't know about the landscape in Mexico, but a lot of philanthropy and foundations in the United States are kind of going through this reckoning right now of what does it mean to decolonize philanthropy? And one of the answers to that is open up their process and do kind of co-planning, work with their grantees on evaluation metrics and much more participatory processes. So I think there is a shift towards having more open processes. And so if you can, harness the zeitgeist that's around like decolonizing the way traditionally things have been done financially, I think there is a lot of opportunity for that. There's also, when there's government support, it's a big when, but when there is government support for a community process, there often at times is a lot of funding, at least for a prototype version of something, maybe not for ongoing, which can present its own challenge. But I think, let's see, you said what is maybe a dead end? I think just frankly, I think that a lot of forms of traditional capital, whether they're investors or companies or organizations, like aren't really open to the idea of completely participatory processes yet. And so that would be a challenge. That's a huge mental shift that needs to happen. It's kind of like trust the people and they can be trusted, but you have to get to the place of being able to trust people, and that doesn't always align with how capitalism works and how for-profit works. So I don't know that that's a direct answer of like what would be a dead end, but I think, yeah, for us and for the projects I've worked on, where we found it to be most successful is private investment, where the investors themselves are really committed to a community process, and governments who, again, are committed to a community process. Yeah, good question.
Well, thank you so much, Ilana. And thank you, everyone, for being here, for your participation, for your excellent questions. I also want to thank my colleagues, Paulina Cornejo and Carla Paniagua, who co-organized this event with me. Of course, thank you, Ilana, for being here, for sharing your ideas. And we hope to continue seeing you here in Mexico and with these amazing projects. Thanks a lot.
Diseño para la innovación social es generar proyectos que realmente tienen un resultado y un impacto en el largo plazo y que son soluciones de base, remitiéndonos mucho a ese usuario o a esa usuaria justamente para solucionar una problemática de personas, desde personas. En mi caso, por ejemplo, están relacionadas con temas de seguridad alimentaria, con temas de aprovechamiento sostenible de recursos naturales, también contar con la participación de las personas para todo el proceso de diseño. Soy mamá de un peque de 5 años, estoy justamente como directora general en una organización, entonces el reto de estudiar una especialidad como centro es un reto muy fuerte, pero que ha valido totalmente la pena.
Ya no voy a dar marcha atrás ya nunca, porque es una mentalidad y una manera de trabajar que no tenía antes. Llevaré el diseño estratégico y el diseño de experiencias a otro nivel, analizando y cuestionando constantemente cómo el cambio va a afectar el futuro de nuestras profesiones. Los futuros te permiten estar como un paso más adelante y poder conectar entre el pasado, interpretarlo en cómo lo vivimos ahora, pero también cómo queremos ser y hacia dónde queremos que nuestras industrias vayan. Mi nombre es Mayra Álvarez, soy egresada de la especialidad del diseño del mañana, 7ª generación en Centro.
En definitiva, hay un Carlos antes y un Carlos después de la maestría. Los estudios del diseño es una manera literal de atacar problemáticas a partir del research. Cualquier proyecto visto a través de los estudios del diseño nos lleva a escenarios que posiblemente no nos imagináramos. Proyectos de escuela fueron los que me abrieron la puerta a un trabajo nuevo. Soy Carlos Moreno, estudié la maestría en estudios de diseño en Centro.